I'm no pop culture maven, so the youth here especially will know this. It's no surprise that I was late coming to love the hit musical Hamilton. But I always remember the moment that I first heard about it. It was the summer of 2020, and I was sitting at our youth group's Empathy tent at the Jamestown Public Market. In the midst of all the upheaval and grief of the pandemic, we were there to have conversations with people, to listen to their stories, and to practice what we had been learning as a youth group about nonviolent communication. In a lull between visitors to our tent, one of the youth began talking enthusiastically about Hamilton. I confessed I had never listened to it. Scandalized, she replied, "Give me your phone." Soon enough, she was playing her favorite songs from the musical and enthusiastically explaining the plot line, an overview of the life and times of Alexander Hamilton. In the show, Hamilton is obsessed by his legacy. His desire to be seen, to leave a mark on history is a gift and a curse. It is the passion that drives him to work nonstop in shaping this new nation. Protecting, curating his legacy is also the obsession that pushes him to make choices at whatever cost, even to the detriment and hurt of his family. As the musical comes to a close, Hamilton looks back on his life and reflects. Legacy, he says. What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. Planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. I love that. This Martin Luther King Day weekend, I'm thinking about legacies, about seeds sown for unknown future generations. Now, I mentioned Dr. King with some trepidation because it's tempting for a white preacher to nostalgically evoke Dr. King's legacy this weekend and to appropriate it, to speak about dreams and justice and to leave it at that, to confuse preaching about the work with doing the work. But there's something about remembering, about telling the story of those who have gone before us that does have power and is work worth doing. Because so often with the great leaders and shapers of history, it's easy to flatten them, a bit like the characters in the stained glass windows, that they're not really people in the same sort of way, that maybe somehow the way that they lived their lives, well, it was with more certainty and knowledge than what we had. Maybe somehow their lives were less bewildering, confusing, their times less chaotic. Maybe they somehow knew exactly what to do. But I don't think that's the case. For the people whose legacies we remember were people just like us, living in messy, confusing, frightening times, just like us. For example, somehow I always assumed that Dr. King had always been a civil rights leader. I never thought too much about his life before the Montgomery bus boycott. But the truth of the matter is that Dr. King did not spring forth fully formed as a civil rights leader. Rather, he became this man bit by bit, step by step, his response to one circumstance after another, one faithful decision and action after another. Prior to that movement, Dr. King was a young, dynamic pastor early in his career, occupied by the business of running the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. At the time of the bus boycott, he felt pressed, preparing for his church's annual planning conference, kind of like our annual meeting coming up in the next couple of weeks. He was expected to present his congregation with a detailed program for the year ahead, complete with a schedule of events and a new budget. He was supportive of the bus boycott. He offered the church basement as a meeting space for the organizers, but he initially turned down the nomination to serve as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, as the Boycott Association would be called. However, eventually, King was persuaded to help lead the movement. And the rest, as they say, is history. But that's not quite true, because history is never that clean-cut or straightforward. I'm reminded, actually, of the story of Andrew, who we heard about in today's gospel. I had never really thought about this or paid any attention for all the times I've heard his story, that before he was a follower of Jesus, he was a disciple of John the Baptist. He was faithfully going forward bit by bit, step by step, decision by decision, following one man, one way, until something happened, something changed. The Spirit moved within him, and he turned and went in a different direction, became a disciple of someone and something even greater. And so, just as the story of Andrew and Dr. King were not straightforward, that's a fact of all of our lives. The truth is that every life and legacy is unclear for the person who is living in it. That's the tension that I love in today's passage from Isaiah. It holds all the hope and toil of human life. It contains the quiet confidence of a person working in service of God and God's kingdom. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, God called me. Yet it also recognizes the resistance and the difficulty a person faces in the process of living into this mystery. The text names the servant as despised, abhorred. He speaks of working in vain. Living into our legacy is never straightforward. We will experience our belovedness in the eyes of God, yes, perhaps, but we will also meet resistance, be it internal or external. I'm struck this morning by the first words of Jesus in the Gospel of John, the first words he speaks on the stage. What are you looking for? He asks. What do you seek? It's a question that resonates and echoes across the centuries. The gospel witness begins perhaps with the individual, and yet it expands ever outward, beginning with an individual, going out to the community, and rippling out to a nation, and then the world. John the Baptist, for instance, explains that his ministry is that Jesus might be revealed to Israel. But the revelation doesn't stop there. It doesn't stay confined to Israel. It expands outward to the whole world, across history. After all, we're all here. We see in the ministry, witness, and legacy of Dr. King that his work began in his congregation and expanded in time to the civil rights movement. But it didn't stay there. It expanded ever wider, recognizing the intersectionality of the communities of the world. He spoke out against the Vietnam War. He began advocating for workers' rights. So this question of Jesus begins, what are you looking for? Yet as we walk along the gospel path, being faithful to the best of our ability, I believe the Spirit will transform this question within all of us, as the gospel calls us over and over to greater empathy and compassion. It may begin with, what are you looking for? But it expands to, what is your neighbor looking for? I see the Spirit asking us this question here and now as the city of Jamestown and as the congregation of St. Luke's, as we proceed with the work of welcoming our new neighbors through refugee resettlement. For example, what are our neighbors looking for? We ask ourselves this question as the city of Jamestown struggles to find housing for people who do not have stable housing, particularly in these cold winter months. What are our neighbors looking for? Over and over, we're called to ask this question, to wonder, how can we be neighbors? What are they looking for? For in fact, it's what we are all looking for: connection, belonging. I wonder, when was the last time you reflected on your legacy? It's an enormous question. But have you ever wondered about how your life has touched others? How you'll be remembered? The body of work you'll leave behind? These are big questions and at once perhaps beautiful and unsettling. I've found major life events can stir up these reflections. The death of a parent or a loved one, the birth of a child, the prospect of retirement, taking medical leave, or changing careers. But sometimes these questions come in quieter, less obvious moments, perhaps over the course of a 3-day weekend. I've been thinking, I have to confess, a good deal about these questions as this fall I just got a little bit closer to 40 and realizing that my age will soon be equidistant between 20 and 60. These thoughts are taking on a different depth and weight and urgency. And what's more, these days I think about my daughter, but also the sons and daughters of others. I know I yearn to contribute to a community that I am proud to raise Penelope in, one that strives for peace and justice among all people and respects the dignity of every human being. Because this is the gospel. This is the good news. This is the good life. To not only be part of, but to participate in creating a community where we are all neighbors, where we recognize the interconnectedness of our struggles and our stories, and we work not to leave anyone to struggle alone. So this day, perhaps we can look back and reflect on the seeds that those who have gone before us have sown, because they left a legacy in a garden we get to see. But the question we have is, how do we carry those seeds forward? How do we collect them and sow them for the next generation, for our children and our grandchildren, for our new neighbors' children and grandchildren, ever expanding outward? Today, this Dr. King weekend, tomorrow, and in the decades and centuries to come. Amen.